At this particular moment in American life, it is almost impossible to exist without being presented with a barrage of rhetoric almost every day. When you look at your phone or your computer, it is there. When you watch a video on Twitter or YouTube or TikTok, it attacks you. It is there. Each day, you see a number of news stories, political statements, brand slogans, other forms of advertising. Really, many of these are forms of advertising, even if we don't imagine, for example, a political speech as advertising, but all of them are designed to sell you something. Rhetoric, at its heart, as I've already mentioned, is the art of persuasion. One thing you are probably aware of is how deeply rhetoric sinks into one thing you probably already know is that rhetoric can be used to present the same event or incident in different ways by people with different agendas, different things to sell. How something is characterized or portrayed drastically affects its reception and its marketability to particular audiences. And I noticed a particularly wonderful example of this year in actually an incident that had to do with rhetoric. So it's the one I've chosen to explain to you. Back in March, at the beginning of coronavirus, different streams of rhetoric were coming at us from many different individuals with different rhetorical agendas, different things they wanted to sell you. Some people wanted to sell us the idea. Some people wanted to persuade us that coronavirus wouldn't be so bad. Other people wanted to convince us that this was an imminent threat that we had to address immediately. And over the course of the first few months of the coronavirus, however you stand, I'm sure you've noticed that people have very different opinions about how it should be handled, and they have very different rhetoric that they use to try to persuade you that it is or isn't important to wear a mask or to exhibit your own personal freedom, or that it is or isn't affiliated with a important for members of a particular political party to behave in a particular way. And I want to look at a couple news articles about our Vice President, Mike Pence. So I'm just searching Mike Pence rhetoric. I think one of these results is possibly not going to be very relevant, but most of the other ones, as you look at my search results, you'll notice that they're all coming from the same day in March, which is pretty remarkable because Mike Pence on March 12th made a comment about the rhetoric of coronavirus. Now, the first thing you need to notice here is the way that most of these articles, except for the third one down, which is just talking about Vice President Pence's rhetoric and really has nothing to do with this issue, most of them are quoting the same phrase that Mike Pence says. Somehow in some phrase, Mike Pence referred to irresponsible rhetoric. This is a quotation. Mike Pence said that, but it's very easy to take quotations out of context. So look at the top result, this one up here. Pence says there's been irresponsible rhetoric. Now, this article is trying to be fairly neutral. Pence says there's been irresponsible rhetoric, and if you keep looking, you'll notice that the article says there's been irresponsible rhetoric from people who have downplayed the coronavirus. And the second article down does much the same thing. Mike Pence, implies, says, there's been some irresponsible rhetoric. That's a use of a passive phrase. There has been some irresponsible rhetoric, so I want you to notice here that Mike Pence isn't specifically taking the blame for the rhetoric. Let's go down here. Pence agrees that there's been irresponsible rhetoric. This is also important. Pence is agreeing with somebody else that there's been irresponsible rhetoric. We don't know who that other person is. If we click on the article, we'd find out. But Pence is acknowledging, agreeing this irresponsible rhetoric. It's sort of like showing, but it's possibly a little kinder to Pence. Now, the next is where it gets more fun. Pence admits downplaying coronavirus situation is, and the next word is going to be something like dangerous. So Pence admits is a very important phrase. If Pence admits that there's a problem, does that mean that Mike Pence was complicit in the problem? That's certainly what the tone of the article wants you to consider. But if we go down a few more entries just to look at a different stance, here we have from HuffPost, Mike Pence criticizes irresponsible rhetoric. And the contrast between these two, Pence admits and Pence criticizes, I just want you to think for a moment about the nuances of those two words. Pence admits implies that Mike Pence is somehow to blame in the attitude towards the coronavirus, whereas Mike Pence criticizes, distances Mike Pence very specifically from a series of distances Mike Pence very specifically from the irresponsible rhetoric that's being reported on. Even down here, we gets a little more fun at the bottom. Despite Trump's antics, Pence denounces. So we've moved from criticizing to denouncing, and we've also set up a bit of antagonism between Pence and his president. Now, I don't want to take a stance on this topic. Instead, I want you to think about the difference that a single word can make. Pence says, Pence admits, and Pence criticizes are three completely different ways to present the same moment of rhetoric using three completely different lenses. One of them attempts to be neutral. It doesn't succeed if you read the rest of the article. Pence admits, shifts the blame firmly into Pence's camp, and Pence criticizes, shifts the blame firmly out of Pence's camp. The same words, reported on in three different ways, take on three specifically different tones. This is rhetoric at its finest, and rhetoric can be used in a similar way about almost any event, no matter how incendiary, to set one particular person in the right and to set one particular person or idea in the right and to set a different particular person or incident in the wrong. Neutrality in reporting is by and large a lie. People don't report neutrally. People report to their particular audience, and they take their own ideas and their own slants to try to convince you of the rightness of their particular position.